When discussing the performance of resource-rich nations, Canada is frequently cited as a successful example, together with others like Australia, Chile, Botsuana, and Norway, to name a few. We talked to Claire Woodside to explore the story behind Canada's extractive industries. Claire, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
In historical terms, what has been Canada's greatest virtue in managing its natural resources?
Canada's greatest virtue has really been abundance. Over the last century, Canada has been a globally important producer of many different metals, minerals, and more recently petroleum and natural gas. And the sheer abundance of resources in Canada has made it easier for governments not to focus as much attention on whether they're receiving their fair share or whether they're saving for future generations, but rather to profit from the increase in jobs and the short-term benefits to the economy from that extraction.
But there are other countries that also have an abundance of natural resources. There must be something that Canada has done well.
Canada benefits from having a small population and from having strong institutions. Canada is an industrialized country. So those two factors mean that Canada's natural resource exploitation is supported by strong institutions, which is of course a benefit to how effective our natural resources are managed.
Despite this, the last commodity boom, it was not without its challenges for Canada. There was a sharp currency appreciation undermining other export industries. And more generally, there was some doubt over the use of resource revenues in Canada. What happened? Can you tell me a bit more about that?
In the last resource boom, Canada experienced a very typical case of Dutch disease. We saw our currency appreciate as our oil exports grew, and we saw our non-energy exports fall. What was interesting was that politically it was very unpalatable in Canada to speak about it as Dutch disease. And so really there was little recognition that this was happening.
Why do you think that was?
Well, you see, Canada went through the decline of manufacturing at the same time as other industrialized nations. However, Canada's decline was exacerbated by the high dollar, which made adaptation far more difficult and it made the decline more rapid. And I think it was also just a difficult subject to approach because labeling yourself as having Dutch disease is not politically very palatable. It also, touches on how Canada's natural resources are managed. So constitutionally, Canada's natural resources are under the jurisdiction of the provinces. So where we see very uneven growth, that's also at the provincial level. So in Canada, one of the key indicators of Dutch disease was that we saw Ontario become what we call a have-not province, which means they began receiving equalization payments from the federal government, while we saw other resource-rich provincial economies become have provinces, where they stopped receiving those equalization payments. But touching on this as a phenomenon of Dutch disease would have also targeted those provinces, which politically was not very acceptable.
And did this spark a discussion about whether Canada should rely as much as it does on natural resources?
Not really, not a mainstream discussion. I mean, interestingly, throughout the whole boom, we didn't really see a focus at all, even on savings. So during this period, Alberta, which is the home of the oil sands, saw between 2009 and 2015 $9 to $11 billion in royalty revenues a year. Yet the Alberta Heritage Trust Fund, Savings Fund, barely grew throughout that period. Similarly, we saw other resource-rich economies really undertake very little savings or even talk about savings. So when the bust hit, they found governments, for example, the government of Newfoundland found itself without any tools to deal with the drop in government revenues from royalties.
And still, there was no discussion saying maybe we should move away from natural resource reliance.
Well, at that point, there was some, but I think there's a general acceptance in Canada that we are a resource-rich country, and this will always be a key part of our economy.
Speaking of oil, the production from oil sand in Alberta has been big over the past 15 years. Now, with lower oil price seemingly set to continue, what are the prospects for oil sands in Canada?
Oil production has really not been affected by the drop in oil prices in the oil sands. The oil sands have seen sustained production levels and even growth in production through this period of bust. And that's partly because in an effort to keep revenues up, some companies have even increased production. Interestingly, I think what we will see is a switch of techniques. So this could mean the demise of the iconic oil sands mine. So certain types of bitumen sit very close to the surface. And the bitumen in the Athabasca oil sands are really ripe for surface mining. So when we think about the oil sands, we think of those surface mines, which are really the image of the oil sands. But those are capital-intensive projects. And we may not see continued investment in that type of technique. However, there are other techniques to extract bitumen, particularly bitumen that sits below the surface. In situ techniques, where you use high pressure steam to heat the bitumen and extract it. And I think we're going to see a shift to that because it requires less capital and it can be done on a smaller scale.
Now, the Canadian oil companies, they are producing in Canada. Why haven't they moved to become international players and international producers?
I don't have a full sense of that answer, but I think part of it must be that their real competitive advantage is non-conventional oil production. And Canada, there aren't really very many places in the world that have a lot of non-conventional oil production. So applying that competitive advantage in Canada makes the most sense, where we have the third largest reserves in the world in terms of oil, and almost all of it is non-conventional.
Moving from oil into mining, Canada is a heavyweight when it comes to producing. It's also home to some of the largest mining companies that are operating worldwide. We have Barrick and Teck, Kinross, etc. Do these companies operate abroad with the same standards as expected in Canada?
Many large Canadian mining companies work to develop and practice, develop and employ best practice standards throughout all of their operations. But it doesn't mean that those are uniform across companies, across projects, or across regions. And this is evident in the fact that Canadian mining companies have been at the heart of well-documented human rights abuses and environmental disasters. But one of the things to remember is that Canada's mining sector is incredibly diverse. With 1,200 companies listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Venture Exchange, we have many, many small exploration companies, almost 1,000, and then many larger companies. And these companies have very different capacities to develop and implement standards. And it's not that the standards should be different across the different capacities, but that they have a different ability to implement those standards, and they need to be approached differently.
So you're talking about large mining companies versus the juniors, and that they have different capacities to deal with the issues?
Absolutely. So a junior mining company may only be a couple of people, right? You may only have a couple of employees. They may be very, very small. Yet they're engaging. They're often frontline in the first discussions with communities and frontline in negotiations with governments. So they play a critical role in the development of resources. And they need to be engaged in understanding their human rights obligations and other environmental standards they should be abiding by, but their capacity is low.
I want to move into the area of transparency. You're from the Publish What You Pay organization. We're focusing on transparency. Just very basic, why is transparency important for resource economies?
Transparency is critical for resource economies in order to ensure that they have the information they need to create effective policies and to do those in an inclusive way. Without transparency, there is frequently information asymmetries between the different stakeholders in any kind of policy development process. And often it's civil society that is disadvantaged by those information asymmetries. So transparency is a tool in the hands of civil society to engage in informed advocacy, informed discussions about their natural resources.
But is there an empirical correlation between transparency and economic growth?
Broadly, there is. Studies show that transparency supports strong institutions, which is associated with economic growth. There have been studies that have cast doubt on the link between control on corruption and, for example, the implementation of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. But I think the dynamics between transparency and corruption and strong institutions is something globally we're all still trying to understand.
Now, NGOs or civil society and industry, they often sit at opposite sides of the table. But in Canada, your organization, Publish What You Pay, and industry, they actually collaborated to get crucial legislation approved. Tell me about that experience. How has that been?
In Canada, we faced a really unique situation. So for civil society, we had the advocacy goal of having Canada pass legislation that would require that all Canadian extractive companies disclose payments to governments.
the working abroad or working domestically?
Exactly, in Canada and abroad. But we also had a government that was not interested in transparency, nor really in engaging with civil society, and could be somewhat hostile to civil society organizations focused on the extractive sector. So engaging with industry gave us the opportunity to actually mobilize our issue and get the attention of government. For industry, they were coming out of a period of really fractured relationships with Canadian civil society organizations. And for them, I think there was some clear benefits. For large mining companies, they were already used to transparency. Some were voluntarily disclosing payments. Others provided a lot of project-level disclosure, which was one of the key asks of civil society within this discussion, was that payment disclosure be at the project level. So there was a certain comfort with the type of disclosure being asked for, with transparency, but also with engaging with civil society.
As far as I understand, you established a very formal relationship with industry and working together. What did you do? How did that take form?
Yeah, so we established a very formal public policy collaboration based on an MOU and an extended MOU, where we agreed to the terms by which we were going to engage with industry, and then where we followed through on that agreement. It was a very positive experience for Canadian civil society in that the agreements led to a strong mandatory reporting law, which ultimately was supported by the recommendations of the working group that we formed. And those recommendations were consensus recommendations developed with industry.
How do you turn that transparency into accountability, which I assume is what you want to do now?
This is a real challenge, you know, and there's a focus within the Publish What You Pay Global Coalition on data usage and increasing our capacity to use data, to visualize it, to mobilize it, to analyze it, contextualize it. And within Publish What You Pay Canada, we're doing the same thing. But it's still a challenge. You know, any question of when you look at one data point of payment disclosure and you ask, why does it seem lower than anticipated? Answering that question is a huge challenge. It requires knowledge of the commodity, of the sector, of the country, of the particular contract. But this is something we're working on, developing this knowledge base, undertaking the analysis we need to make this payment data really relevant and useful.
But is this the role of civil society only, or should you get support from other stakeholders, the government, for example?
I think this is the responsibility of everyone. So all the stakeholders in natural resource governance should be interested in analyzing and understanding this data. But you know, from the part of civil society, we also have to embrace our responsibility in that we advocated for these laws, and now we need to use this data to inform our next advocacy planks.
And then moving forward, for the transparency agenda, is that what you will focus on, making sure that this data translates into accountability?
For Publish What You Pay Canada, absolutely. You know, our focus over the next few years is going to be on data usage and on really understanding how to make this data meaningful, how to mobilize it, how to contextualize it. And this has a lot of intersections with the tax justice movement, because anytime you're trying to understand a particular payment data point, you have to understand the context by which a company may be able to lower that payment through tax evasion, avoidance, completely legal or illegal means, erosion of the tax base. So for us, this is a key focus. I think for other coalitions, there will also be a focus on environmental and social reporting, which is an important emerging issue in the Publish What You Pay Global Coalition.
Moving from financial data disclosure to some other types of data that they want to disclose.
It's a way of thinking about data that's important to ensuring environmental laws are enforced, or that social standards are enforced. So, for example, in the EITI, some countries are requiring that the country disclose how environmental legislation is enforced, the number of people enforcing it, the resources available. So it's thinking about certain types of environmental and social issues from a data perspective.
Which is quite different than looking at financial data, which is obviously just a number that you can dig out. But quantifying the social and environmental, that must be a challenge.
It is a challenge, but it fits with the kind of focus on climate change disclosure and understanding how transparency can be a tool and a part of the global discussions about climate change and global discussions about social and environmental concerns, which are really top of mind for many civil society organizations.
And with that, our talk has come to its end. Thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
Thank you.
And to keep up with the new debate on extractives and development, join us at rawtalks.org.